Unbiased information.
Honest and forthright.
News without the misinformation.
It doesn't matter what side you're from. What matters is what you say, the truthfulness behind it.
Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Welcome back, folks. Welcome back to TNT, Today's News Talk. I'm Patrick Henningsen, your host. Thank you for rejoining us here on Wednesday. We're still in the first hour of this live broadcast, and I want to welcome onto the program our European correspondent, Freddie Ponton, on the line right now. And there's a couple of things that we want to talk about, not just European-wise, but internationally. But let's start with what's happening in France right now. Freddie, thank you for joining us this week.
Well, it's a pleasure being here, Patrick. Thank you very much to have me on the show.
So we see the scenes. Well, we've seen the scenes, Freddie, from Germany. We've seen the Dutch before that. We see farmers all around Europe, not just Europe, Freddie, around the world, in fact, but mainly in Europe. Let's focus on Europe. And everybody's just kind of sitting back waiting for what the French are going to do, because when it comes to strikes, protests, and manifestations, the French tend to lead the way in terms of the impact in Europe. And it looks like the French farmers are mobilizing on this issue. Just give us a little bit of an insight, a look. What are things like on the ground there?
Well, it's a very interesting, Patrick, a very fast-paced moving development from the farmers in France. I mean, it's really basically benefiting from the energy that we saw coming out of Germany. So I think the timing is perfect. And we're going to see, obviously, a bit later on the reason behind this. But right now, I think we saw yesterday, there was a lot of posts on social media about the French farmers basically coming from different regions of France, moving towards Paris. And it was described by some of the press as a siege on Paris. That's how big it was. And we can clearly see that the Farmers' Confederations, which is the third agricultural union, is now really calling for major mobilizations amongst the farmers across the country. So they want them to block the purchasing centers in the countries, all the logistic platforms for large-scale distributions, the wholesale market like Rungis, the second world biggest food wholesales international market in the southern suburb of Paris. So a lot of things is happening. We can see farmers that have moved their trucks by hundreds and hundreds getting onto the highway. We have eight motorways that are basically completely blocked today. And I checked again this morning, and it was still the case, where they've literally moved towards this major international food market in order to really take a stand. And it looks like it's going to be for the long run. So it's a major mobilization, and it's happening also all across the nation. So it's really, the numbers are absolutely staggering. We're talking about 12,000 farmers already that have moved towards Paris, 6,000 tractors. 6,000 tractors on the road. I can tell you will notice it, and not a lot of people will move. But there are many other plans. Some of them are obviously more talked on the sidelines, so I don't want to reveal their plans, of course. But on the other side, I think there's still a lot of things to gather from the social media, a lot of posts about how they're doing it, how they're approaching now. Few miles, already tractors have already arrived at Rungis, this international food wholesale market, and they're going to try basically to put everything to a halt. So it's done so far very peacefully. We haven't seen any report from the police talking about clashes or nothing physicals. There's been a couple of arrests. The police has used a certain law in terms of obstructing the public ways and passage in order to basically remove some of the tractors, which seems to have taken positions that literally are blocking the way for trucks to exit the market. So it's coming up. It's basically in the making as we speak. And I think they didn't come just for a couple of days. I think this is a long run, and they want to be heard this time, and they're going to try to have it their way for sure. So that's
Freddie, just this is different tactics, isn't it? Because in the past, with these types of demonstrations and protests, there would be disruption, block the roads, disrupt traffic, get the government's attention. But this is more targeted. They're going for the distribution lines the supply chain that feeds the hypermarkets in France, which could cause major uproar. So is this sort of new tactics, more precise tactics?
Yeah, definitely. This is extremely well coordinated on a national basis. So nationwide there is a plan. Clearly, we can see that from the territorial intelligence services, for example, they reported that they've identified already nearly 120 blockages across the nation. These are points that are very strategic across the country. And as I say, this is a deep-rooted farmers movement that is going to fight very hard because they are fighting for their survival. So yes, it's not really a change of tactics. It's just simply bigger. It's more determined. And I think it's more for the long run as well. I think they're not going to leave until they get what they want.
What are their demands? What are the demands precisely? Like, are they? Is there a specific listed demands, or are these old demands that are being reintroduced with this crisis? What are the main points?
Well, the main points, of course, every union has their own revendication, if you will. They're all basically asking certain, conditions as far as the farmers' conditions, because it has deteriorated over the years. So every union has a kind of list of complaints and things that they want to see. But I think there are major points that really need to be addressed. And we can see that the overall complaint has to do with the European farm to fork strategy. It has to do with the French, basically the European Green Deal, which is certainly a major component as part of the discontent amongst the mobilized French farmers. And this is all related basically to the what they call the EU environmental roadmaps, Patrick. And within these EU environmental roadmaps, we can see a lot of components within, especially that are related to measures and conditions that need to be obeyed, is attacking directly the level of productions that these agriculture and these farmers are able to put out. So it's affecting directly the production, up to 15% for some of them, even more. And it's becoming basically a struggle for the survival, because clearly the bottom line and what they have in common with the German is that they can no longer make a living out of their job. And this is really a last chance for them to stand and say, well, if you want farmers and if you want food to come, and we have great privilege in France, we're able to produce our own food. So it's really unbelievable that we would be put in a conditions whereby for environmental issues, we'll end up having no more farmings, or, all the small farmers disappearing. So the conditions that they are under at the moment due to the EU regulation and due to this European Green Deal, making it very difficult for them to do end meet at this moment in time.
Wow. So basically the government is trying to impose kind of, Great Reset style, UN Sustainable Development Goals style restrictions that basically take away the profit margin. Because a lot of people don't realize, Freddie, that farming has a very, very thin profit margin. You have to make that very thin profit margin to make it worth doing the business every year. And they rely on that. It's a very delicate balance, isn't it, agriculture? You've got to hit it just right. Yeah. And so the government's attacking that. They're attacking that thin margin.
Well, it is, but again, this is all a major problem of sovereignty, because we are really dependent on the European, basically directives, and this European, basically Green Deal has components in it that basically forces the farmers to comply if they still want to retain their license or their ability to export and to be players in the game. So as you said, rightly so, and perhaps even the EU farm to fork strategy, which we can talk about, is really a major component of that, because it is a microcosm, if you will, of the Great Reset and the Build Back Better. They went after the systems, since the Great Reset was announced. They went after the health system. They went after the defense system. They're attacking all the system to rebuild them, to the Build Back Better, rebuild them, but rebuild them for themselves. This is the great public-private gangstership that is putting together basically a plan so that all the small farmers, all the small players disappear, only for basically the elite and this big corporation to be able to access the land and be the major supplier for the food on a global basis. So there has a lot of lack within this strategy, especially in the EU Farm for Folk strategy. We see that there's three major points, Patrick, which I think clearly is putting a lot of pressure on the farmers. The first one being about reducing the overall use of chemical pesticide, and they want to reduce that by 50%, and also the use of hazardous pesticide by 50% by 2030. So what it means basically is that if you don't have seed that are appropriate to grow certain crops, and if you're going to stop using this pesticide, basically your yield is going to be, 2 or even 3 times less than it normally is, and you get 8 billion people you need to feed on the planet. So if you apply that to Europe and to a certain extent on a global level, you're going to miss half of the food productions, in no time. And when that happens, it's very important to understand is that you're going to have no other choice but to look at other means, basically to cultivate. So you're going to go and start to look for other cultivable lands like rainforest, or you're going to attack, grasslands and so on. So it's going to have anyway an impact on the biodiversity. So a lot of things is not really making sense at this moment. And then the second point, Patrick, is they want to reduce the fertilizer use by at least 20% by 2030. That's part of the plan, if you will. So they hope to achieve this by reducing what they call nutrient losses. And it means that basically reducing what farmers need to apply to actually being able to produce and to be profitable. So every single basically norms, every single decisions and point that is outlined in this Green Deal and this in this strategy is basically affecting the bottom line, especially of small farmers. And then the last point, there is a third point about increasing land devoted to organic farming. I think it's up to 25% in total, Patrick, and that's going to be done all across Europe by 2030. So yet again, this is going to affect a lot, the yields across the board. You're going to lose at least, as I say, a third of the productions by going. If you're going to go for 25% of organic farming, you need to compensate that somewhere. So how are you going to compensate that? Well, you're going to have to look for more cultivable land, and that's the problem. We saw that in Brazil, with the soybeans. They're basically taking lands from the rainforest so that they can increase basically the output, and that's extremely dangerous because we're not able to do that in Europe, but Brazil, under certain circumstances, will be able to do that, and they are not subjected to the same rules that we are subjected in Europe, and yet they're going to compete directly with our farmers in Europe. So very dangerous because we're talking about a livelihood of thousands and thousands of farmers that are at risk here, Patrick.
So basically what you're saying here, Freddie, is that they want to restrict through all these various new programs, green programs, Build Back Better, et cetera, restrict production in Europe, move more towards organic, reduce pesticides, but that's going to reduce the total food production. That's going to leave an opening in the market, which needs to be filled. So they're going to end up getting that from Brazil or maybe an African country where there's no regulation, where the environmental damage is even more in those areas in order to fill the production gap in Europe. So they're basically offshoring the same problem that they're trying to solve in Europe, isn't it?
Well, yeah, they put on some draconian measures, upon the farmers across Europe. And that's why you got so many countries that are infuriated, because they have to comply. There's no choice. There's no other way. They have to comply. And this particular compliance, is basically effective the competitiveness on the global market. So I'll give you a straight example. You get a lot of eggs coming out of Ukraine. Ukraine is not even in Europe, yet they've been given a special authorization to sell their Class A eggs in France. But they are not CE eggs, which is basically confirmed Europe. They are not basically European materials. They are not subjected to European norms, if you will. They're not certified, yet they are able to trade and to sell the eggs in France and other countries. So it's very, very unfair for these farmers, which they have to invest in streamlining their production, if you will, to be compliant. Where on the other side of Ukraine now, there's this, billionaires out of Ukraine that have massive chicken farms and eggs productions. They're not subjected to any of this control, this check, and anything like that. Same goes for the meat market. We get basically 60% of the meat that comes outside of Europe. So therefore, they are not subjected to these compliance issues and these certifications issue. We're going to have at the moment a major issue that's happening right now as we speak, which is the discussion over the EU Mercosur deal in between basically the European Union and a trading bloc from South America with Brazil and so on. So Macron, the Minister of Economy in France, Bruno Le Maire, came out and said, we cannot do that because our breeders are just simply going to collapse if we let that happen. So they're trying to fight for it. We're not saying they're in bad faith, but what we are saying is that all the decisions are made in EU. And even Brazil is saying, we don't care what France is saying. We're not dealing with France. We're dealing with the European Union. We're dealing with the European Commission. And that deal is going to be done and be sealed with van der Leyen seal, if you will, with the van der Leyen approval, which is not very comfortable news, So this is the problem we have at the moment, is that everything is centralized in Europe. All these guidelines, all these bureaucratic burdens is coming onto the French farmers, and it's not coming out of our government. It's coming out of our government applying basically the European rules, the European recipe, if you will, to meet the climate, and the Paris Accord targets. It's just too much.
So Freddie, I think we see where the game is here. The whole Ukrainian project was designed as a backstop to this situation that we're seeing now, isn't it? A nice little offshore agricultural, unregulated, corrupt sort of market there, right outside of Europe, very quick delivery time, substandard products. You saw about the Ukrainian grain. You saw countries rejecting it because it had some sort of banned chemical in it or something. Yet they're dumping it onto markets and then attacking Polish farmers and all these other farmers that are trying to do it the right way or follow regulations, and stuff's coming in from Ukraine via Brussels. Brussels has let it in. They turned it into a Schengen country, basically. So, but they didn't get all the land that they hoped because Russia moved pretty quick, didn't they, in 2022? So this is interesting, Freddie, when you start to mix this story with some geopolitics, isn't it?
Yeah, you have to, because it's all interconnected, if you will. If you look at basically the farmers in Europe, they all have to basically align themselves with what is known as the Common Agricultural Policy, which is the CAP. Now they spend a lot of money to that, and that money goes towards pensions for farmers, and it goes, Europe is allocating a lot of money to support farmers. Now, if you get Ukraine, that is not a European country, but you're basically entertaining the prospect of integrations as a competitor, which is not a real competitor because he's not European. So he's an outsider playing on the European market. And we have no idea how much they're going to contribute as well to these particular common agriculture policies. So they have massive potential. They're not subjected to any real, pressures or bureaucratic burdens. And yet we're not sure, even with the war for the past 2 years, whether they're going to be able to afford to actually pay for, because it's quite expensive, to pay your fees towards the common agricultural policies. So what's going to be the contribution of Ukraine? Nobody knows. So it's very worrying for the farmers.
Zero.
They look at it, right?
Zero.
My view on it is going to be a zero. It's going to be a green patch,
Yeah, it's nothing. The economy in Ukraine, Freddie, their currency, it's literally, it's down in sort of, poor African country level in terms of value. So like there's nothing going on there in terms of contributions. It's not going to happen. It's literally a cheap offshore destination to get goods and then flood the European market, and all the big, retailers and stuff and middlemen can mark up on it. And so people are making tons of money off of this, and the aid and all of this Ukraine grain program and all that. People are just even in France, they were making money out of it. So it was a big scandal. So this is interesting, this stuff coming out of Brussels and their support for the Ukrainian war. I think it's very good for business for some people in Brussels.
And it goes further than that. If you really want to go deeper and trying to analyze as well these moves were also a response to the BRICS. If you look at the Mercosur agreements that the European Union is currently trying to negotiate, there's been really an ongoing back and forth between Brazil, which kind of a little bit lead the discussions between these South American trade blocs. But look at Brazil is part of the BRICS. So I believe that the European Union is trying to close up on deal with the South American bloc, because they know that if they don't, they're going to leave a vacuum that is going to be exploited by the BRICS, with Brazil first, but also Russia, China is going to want to have their own trade exchange deals with this particular region of the world. So you can look at Ukraine for different reasons. They want Ukraine to be part of this, of this exchange and this trade and these free trade agreements, and get Ukraine as close as possible within the European market. But on the other side of the Atlantic and in South America, these are for complete different reason. But the bottom line is that this is so unacceptable for the French breeders. They won't be able to survive it. I mean, you get quality meat from Brazil that is not subjected basically to any traceabilities. They are not really being negotiated some clear guideline as far as, health and safety, all that kind of things that basically increase basically your overheads as a producer or as a breeder. Well, we don't know really. And then, of course, if you compare that to the human resources and the cost of producing in Brazil or in Bolivia or Venezuela is not the same as, paying the bills of electricity here that has doubled 4 times in not even a year. So we are not even talking about competition here. It's a complete piss take.
Now, back to our guest right now, Freddie Ponton, investigative journalist, researcher out of France. Freddie, we were talking about the farmers' protests, and that's spreading across Europe. It's hit France. It's going to get interesting. We'll see what happens. We'll follow this story too, intermittently as we progress through the next days and weeks. It's not going away, as you said. But internationally, at the UN Security Council level, it seems that some of these countries that are considered to be part of the, quote, global south, mainly African countries, and also countries even in the Maghreb, North Africa, Algeria, very pro-Palestinian in their orientation politically, traditionally. And of course, they have a very interesting history, don't they, Algeria, with their former colonial masters, France. They're taking a pretty hard stance at the UN Security Council. Explain to us what's happening here.
Well, they were very, very fast. Algeria literally on the back of the ICJ ruling last Friday. I think hours later, they were already asking for an emergency meeting at the United Nations Security Council. And that idea was really to move towards enforcing the ICJ order with its provisional measures. So we've all followed that. We've covered it extensively, but really in few words, it's really about allowing basically the entry of aid on an emergency basis into the Gaza Strip, because the people are simply dying, starvation, disease, you name it. I mean, everything. The Palestinians have been under attack now for 3 months. And of course, the destructions of infrastructures, hospital, anything that is capable of sustaining life has been pretty much destroyed. So it's very hard for a population of over 2.3 million people to be able to function normally. And then, of course, the weather is not helping with the rain, the cold. And the displacements of population in areas where there should be shelters, where they should be feeling safe, security, food. None of that has been basically prepared. And these people are basically in the mud, in the water, in the rain, and trying to simply see whether the international community is going to help them. So they obviously have some hope of something happening, and this ICJ ruling and this court order has been enforced. But I think the Palestinians know too well, and they're very doubtful about the United Nations being able to do anything to stop Israel, which is currently accused of a plausible genocide in Gaza. So the Algerians have moved very quickly. They've not really yet indicated whether they will present a draft, a Security Council resolution today, because they're actually meeting this afternoon as we spoke. They've been for the past 3 hours, literally in private chambers at the United Nations Security Council in New York. But now they're coming out live, so it's actually live at the moment. People can see that on YouTube. They are talking about really the implementation of the ICJ court order. So I've not been able to obviously find out what they said, because I'm with you right now, but I'll jump on it after the show. And then I think what's clearly also interesting is very, very quickly the South African Justice Minister, Rollo Lamola, very quickly said the United Nations Security Council needs to outline the measures that he's planning to take to enforce the ruling of the International Court. So he wants basically the UNSC to take its responsibility to enforce it and to explain what measures they are going to take to stop basically this plausible genocide, which means that are stopping the bombing, stopping basically the attack on hospital. We saw recently, some hospital being under siege, people dying because they couldn't get oxygen. You can see basically religious Zionist movements outside of the Misna border, people that are literally at the Egyptian Gaza border, blocking the trucks from and hindering basically the entry of trucks into the Gaza Strip. So a lot of things is going on that is completely, associated with war crimes or collective punishment that has been proposed during the court pleas as well. So clearly we have a problem here, and the ICJ has done its job. Now it's for the United Nations Security Council to do his, and we're going to be able to see this afternoon what kind of recommendation is going to come out. Now we know the World Food Program, the head of humanitarian aid, all these guys are going to push forward for it because they've been there. So many of them have been back and forth in Gaza, and they saw the level of destructions, and more importantly, what looks like a genocide. So they are basically pushing. But at the end of the day, the United Nations is an institution. The United Nations Security Council has veto powers through their permanent members, including the US, France, UK. And we're going to have a problem with that, because if the US is not going to be supporting basically the enforcement of these provisional measures, which imply a ceasefire, that's a very important thing also to put on the table, Patrick. It implies you don't need to talk. A lot of people were disappointed. Even, of course, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from South Africa, she said it. She said, I would have loved to see ceasefires within the court order, but it's not there. But it doesn't matter, because to imply any aspect of the provisional measures, you're going to need a ceasefire. How are you going to get trucks into the Gaza Strip, without actually stopping the bombing?
Yeah, here's the thing, the people were like, oh, why didn't they put a ceasefire thing in there? This is an unprecedented situation, because normally the Genocide Convention is to prevent a genocide. But now it's already happened, and there's a humanitarian crisis that's already way, way past the point of no return. So the UN, the United Nations World Court, the International Courts of Justice, they said that legally they can't prevent Israel or say that Israel can't defend itself if there's missile attacks or whatever. So that's why they left that part out. So they're putting all the onus on Israel to stop genocidal activities, ergo Article 2 in the Genocide Convention. As you said, Freddie, it's implied. A ceasefire is implied in the ruling. But here's the thing. The only way that ceasefire can happen is that Israel and whatever other parties, counterparties, be it Hamas, be it the United States or whatever, they have to come themselves and make the agreement. The countries still have to do it. and the parties that are involved still have to have that agreement. And whether it's honored or not, it's like is anyone's guess, because Israel certainly doesn't often honor any of its agreements. But that's the risk you take. This is the way the international system is. But
Absolutely.
yeah,
Look,
go ahead.
there's a technicality, Patrick, as well with regards to genocide, and ceasefire. Ceasefire is against a state. It's two states, having war with each other, and basically you call for ceasefire, and if nobody wants to respect it, you're going to deploy the UN troops, to make sure the ceasefire is respected. This is not the case. This is the problem. Because
It's different.
It's different. Yes, exactly. It's emphasizing on the fact that this is an occupying force, basically attacking, the people that they are, the very same people they're responsible for, the occupiers. So technically, it's a little bit, as you said, unusual to bring that to the forefront of the United Nations Security Council. But again, I think also I was actually giving a thought early on, and I was thinking this is a great opportunity for the United States to get out of this kind of liability that Israel has created for themselves, because with this particular ruling, there is legal liability for anyone that is aiding and abetting Israel in what is plausibly looking like a genocide. So if there is a moment for the United States to exit, they can use this language and the verbiage and say, well, in the current court order, there's no word of ceasefire. And our agreement with Israel is that we will veto any ceasefire. But because the verbiage does not mention any ceasefire, from a technical point of view, the US could be having this plausibility of deny and say to Israel, well, I don't have to block anything here because there is no request for ceasefire. I'm just, kind of, going ahead of myself here a little bit.
You're absolutely spot on, Freddie. You're absolutely spot on. This is the opportunity for the U.S. to back out on a technicality and be seen to be doing the right thing during the election year. And also they could abstain as well. So could Britain. And so if it passes, and here's how it plays out, Freddie, you know how the politics is going to play out. Let's say it passes, then the U.S. is saying, well, we support Israel's right to defend itself, but we don't want to take away their ability to do whatever their self-defense, but then we do want to see a peaceful resolution, so we abstained, and then it passes, Freddie. So the U.S. and Britain can say we've done the right thing, we didn't vote against it, and then Israel will just continue to do what they've been doing because they're already taking the hit anyway on this. So like nothing changes, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it has to be done. You have to look at the draft at the Security Council, how they're going to draft basically these measures and what basically the United Nations Security Council is prepared to agree upon on a consensus basis. So there's really two aspects. On one part is the proposal brought forward by Algeria is acceptable, and is there enough traction, enough consensus amongst the permanent members to avoid any kind of veto? Maybe abstaining is a possibility because there's a message in abstention as well. But what's very important here is that also the UNSC knows that they better deal with it right now, because if they don't, well, there is also an option that could happen, and that is basically for South Africa to invoke the Uniting for Peace General Assembly Resolution 377, Section 5. And that particular section is very important, especially the Section A of this resolution, because it states, and I'm going to read it out to you, but it states that the Security Council, because of lack of unanimity of the permanent members, fails to exercise its primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. The General Assembly shall seize itself on the matter, and procedural and substantive steps can be suggested by the GA, by the General Assembly. And that's basically an emergency session. And then from that emergency session, they can use different instruments, including the deployment of forces. So there's a lot of things that can still happen, but I don't think the United States and the UK would want to go that far, because there's a public relation here. And I think we can see that whether it was at the ICJ, whether the way Israel is trying to control the narrative, which they obviously pretty done, and they've pretty lost in doing that. But they're not winning this. And I think this is very important because the US has clearly stated that they didn't want any escalations of war in the region. And they wanted, obviously, Israel to comply with international law, which means that you cannot say comply with international law and not support basically a draft resolution. So we're going to see now within the next few hours what's going to happen and which way this, the UNSC is going to move.
Very interesting how this is going to, we're going to learn a lot, Freddie, aren't we, in the next couple of days as to which direction this is going. So very important. And also you're thinking ahead, showing us the steps that are coming next, what the options are next. So the story does not finish, whatever the vote is in the UN Security Council, the story is not over by any stretch of the imagination. Now, in terms of violations of the Genocide Convention, one of them is denying aid going into Gaza. Okay. And this is exactly what's happening. The U.S. and Israel have spearheaded a campaign to discredit, defund, and destroy the UN Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, which provides and delivers humanitarian aid into Gaza every day. Well, it did before October 7th, but it doesn't now. So, Freddie, on this story, give us the latest as far as you can see.
Well, I mean, my personal view on this, we saw the Wall Street Journal article. I think there's been so much social media about it. I'm sure everybody will know what I'm referring to. But really, the claim of the connections between this UN agency that is really the main core, the lifeline for the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, and having basically using this and saying that there is a direct connection between UNRWA staff and October 7 attack in Israel. Is really a big claim. And of course, it needs to be supported by evidence. And what was really interesting with this article is actually the author of the article. The person that wrote it is a lady called Carrie Keller-Lynn. And a lot of guys and investigative journalists and normal citizen journalists have already very clearly, a couple of search on Google, you can find out that she's basically a former IDF soldier. She's basically worked for a Palestinian-based UN agency. I'm saying that she's not working for a UN agency. She's worked for the Times of Israel, and she works for an Australian Jewish news agency. She was pretty kind of in line with the Zionist philosophy, if you will. And it's very hard for her to have access to some paper like the Wall Street Journal. And more importantly, quick research will establish also a link with a lady called Lieutenant Aliza Landis. Lieutenant Landis is an interesting person because she was basically with the IDF from the very beginning, I think during the Operation Castlade in 2008, and she came up with the idea to set up a desk at the IDF to promote social media, basically, and to help the IDF to create a presence on social media, because she understood that, within 10 years or 20 years, social media will be extremely important and play, of course, an important role in asymmetric warfare. So she knew that the online social media, the narrative needed to be controlled. So she's literally the propagandist in chief of the IDF for social media. And you have pictures on the internet and all over the social media saying that these two girls, Carrie Keller-Lynn and the Lieutenant Aliza Landis from the IDF's are best pals. So obviously a lot of people are getting really cautious about taking these allegations of UNRWA being the staff members being associated with the October 7 attack from the Hamas. And the timing as well is very suspicious, Patrick, because we saw the ICG court order coming out on Friday. Literally 3 days later, you got a major article, about basically attacking the United Nations. That's what it is. It's a direct attack on the United Nations and telling them that you go against us, we're going to come after you. And that's exactly what Israel has done here. So it's a major piece of propaganda. And I think it's a shame for the Wall Street Journal to allow this kind of piece to come out.
Oh yeah, they gave it the green light. They let them right in. We see this so often, Freddie. These sort of planted stories written by people that have absolute conflicts of interest on this, hardly objective. You look at the backgrounds here. Great research by the people exposing this as well. It doesn't take much, Freddie. You just have to pop up their LinkedIn resume or do a few Google searches. I mean, doesn't surprise me. The Wall Street Journal has been backing this war from the very beginning, totally loyal. So it's a Murdoch publication. I think they're under the Rupert Murdoch umbrella, unfortunately. So good work, great journalism, uncovering some of these issues. Freddie, we really appreciate your analysis this week on TNT, Today's News Talk. Keep an eye on all these stories, folks, which Freddie is highlighting because they're developing, and we'll continue to follow those. Thank you, Freddie Ponton.